I can read a balance sheet the way other women read scripture. I can find a shilling that's gone missing from £1,000. Give me 1 month, Your Grace, and I will prove it.
You came for the position.
Yes, Your Grace.
I request for a wife, not a servant girl or a woman carrying ledger.
The frost had crept in through the soles of her boots long before Margaret Fenwick reached the servants' entrance of Rothmere Hall. She had walked 4 miles in the dark, her father's old ledger book pressed against her chest like a shield, rehearsing the words she would say. I can read a balance sheet the way other women read scripture. I can find a shilling that's gone missing from £1,000. Give me 1 month, Your Grace, and I will prove it. She never got the chance to say any of it. The Duke of Rothmere stood in the doorway of his own crumbling study, unshaven, a stack of unpaid accounts scattered across his desk like fallen leaves, and looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he does not have time for. "You're here about the position," he said. "Not a question." "Yes, Your Grace. I was told you required someone to manage the estate accounts. I require a wife." He said it flatly, without a trace of humour, as though the words cost him something to speak aloud. Not a servant, not a girl with a ledger under her arm playing at bookkeeping. "A wife, miss," Fenwick, Meg said, and did not move from the doorway. Something in her voice made him look at her properly for the first time. He had no idea that the woman standing in his frozen doorway was about to save everything he had left, his estate, his name, and quite possibly his life. He was about to find out the hard way. Stay to the end. What Meg finds in those ledgers changes everything. He did not invite her in. For a long moment, Julian Ashcombe simply studied her. The plain wool cloak patched at the elbow, the ink-stained fingers, the steadiness in her eyes that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Behind him, the study told its own story. Ledgers stacked 3 deep. A letter from his solicitor left unopened on the mantel. The fire burned down to embers because coal, apparently, was now a luxury at Rothmere Hall. "Forgive me, Your Grace," Meg said, "but I did not walk 4 miles in the frost to discuss marriage. I came about the position advertised in the Leeds paper. That advertisement was a mistake." He turned back toward his desk, dismissing her. "My mother placed it without my knowledge. I have no need of a bookkeeper." "You have every need of one," Meg said. "The state of your ledgers is likely worse than you know." He stopped. It was Mrs. Colby, the housekeeper, who broke the silence, appearing in the hallway with the particular briskness of a woman who had run the household longer than she cared to admit and had opinions about everything, including dukes. "Your Grace, the girls walked from the mill village in this weather. The least you might do is let her warm herself before you send her off to catch her death." Julian exhaled, some of the hardness leaving his shoulders. 10 minutes, Miss Fenwick. Mrs. Colby will see you to the kitchen." It was in the kitchen, over weak tea Meg did not touch, that she learned the shape of things, from Mrs. Colby's careful, measured words and the things she did not quite say. The estate manager, Mr. Dray, had done his best these last years, though tenant complaints had grown louder each season. Lady Prudence, the Duke's mother, had already begun making inquiries about a Miss Harriet Colston, an heiress from Harrogate, whose fortune might settle things, Mrs. Colby's phrase, delivered with a tightness around her mouth that suggested she thought little of the arrangement. Meg thought of Thomas, coughing through the night in their cold rooms above the chandler's shop, the physician's bill she could not pay, the tin box under her bed with exactly 11 shillings in it. She thought of her father, who had taught her every column and every trick a dishonest clerk might play, and who had died believing no one would ever let his daughter use what he'd given her. She set down her tea, untouched, and asked to see the Duke again. She was not leaving without that position, whether he wanted a bookkeeper or not. Julian was not accustomed to being summoned by his own kitchen staff, and he said as much when Mrs. Colby informed him that Miss Fenwick wished a word before she left. Then let her say it and be done, he muttered, though he rose from his desk regardless. Meg was waiting in the hall, her cloak still damp, her chin set in a way that reminded him uncomfortably of his late father, a man who had never once backed down from an argument he believed himself right about. "Your Grace, I understand you have no wish to hire me. I ask only this, let me examine your ledgers for 1 hour. If I find nothing amiss, I will leave and trouble you no further. If I do find something—" She paused, choosing her words with the care of a woman who knew exactly how much was riding on them. "You may decide then whether an hour of my time was worth a month's wages. And if I refuse, then I expect Mr. Dray will be very relieved," Meg said, "though I cannot think why an honest man would be. It was a gamble, and she knew it the moment she said it. She had not meant to name Dray directly, had only meant to press on the Duke's pride. But something shifted in his expression, quick and buried, gone before she could read it fully. "You know nothing of Mr. Dray," Julian said. "No, Your Grace. I know numbers, and numbers, unlike men, do not know how to lie convincingly for very long." He gave her the hour. She worked at the small desk in the corner of his study, while he pretended to occupy himself with correspondence, watching her from the corner of his eye more than he intended to. She moved through the ledgers with a quiet, methodical hunger, column after column, her lips moving faintly as she added sums in her head faster than he could follow them on paper. Twice she frowned. Once she went very still. "Something troubles you," he said finally, unable to bear the silence. "Several things, Your Grace." She turned the ledger to face him, her finger resting on a column of figures from the tenant harvest rents. This entry, the Michaelmas rents from the Eastern farms. The total recorded here does not match the sum of the individual entries above it. It is off by nearly £40. A clerical error. Perhaps. She turned 2 pages back. But it is the same £40, near enough, missing from the September accounts as well. And the November. Errors are careless and inconsistent, Your Grace. This is neither. Julian said nothing for a long moment, staring at the numbers as though they might rearrange themselves into an innocent explanation. "Mr. Dray has managed this estate for 11 years, he said quietly, "since before my father died." "Then Mr. Dray has had 11 years to learn precisely how much a duke does not wish to look too closely at his own accounts," Meg said. Outside, the light was already beginning to fail, and somewhere down the corridor, a door closed rather more firmly than necessary. The door, as it happened, belonged to Cornelius Dray. He appeared in the study within the quarter hour, ostensibly to discuss the matter of a fallen fence along the northern boundary, though his eyes went first to the ledger open on the Duke's desk and to the woman seated beside it, with ink on her fingers. "Your Grace." Dray's bow was correct, unhurried. He was a solid, comfortable-looking man of perhaps 50, with the kind of face that inspired trust precisely because it seemed to want nothing for itself. "I wasn't aware we had a visitor. Miss Fenwick." Julian did not elaborate further, and Meg noted, with some private satisfaction, that he offered no explanation at all. "She's been reviewing the accounts." Something flickered behind Dray's eyes, there and gone, the way a man's face changes when he is recalculating a plan mid-sentence. "Reviewing them for what purpose, if I may ask? The accounts are rather a specialized matter." "They are numbers, Mr. Dray," Meg said pleasantly. "I find them considerably less specialized than most gentlemen would have a woman believe." A muscle tightened in his jaw, though his smile did not waver. "Of course, though I should say, Your Grace, that estate accounts of this complexity often appear irregular to an untrained eye. Harvest rents fluctuate, tenant arrears carry over. What looks like a discrepancy is very often simply the ordinary untidiness of a working farm. The Michaelmas total is off by exactly the same sum, 3 seasons running," Meg said. "That is not untidiness, Mr. Dray. That is arithmetic." The silence that followed was not comfortable. "I would be glad to walk Miss Fenwick through the full accounts myself," Dre said at last, turning to Julian with the easy confidence of a man who had smoothed over worse moments than this. In private, perhaps, so as not to trouble your grace with tedious detail. I'm sure whatever confusion has arisen can be resolved within the hour. That won't be necessary, Julian said. It was a small thing, 4 words. But Meg saw what it cost him to say them, and saw, too, that Dre heard exactly what lay beneath them. When Dre had gone, bowing his way out with rather more stiffness than he'd entered, Mrs. Colby appeared in the doorway, looking as though she had been listening from the corridor, which she almost certainly had. "He'll not let this rest quietly, Your Grace," she said. 11 years is a long habit to have questioned by a girl of 22. Then he may take his grievance to me directly, Julian said, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Meg gathered the ledgers with steady hands, though her heart had not slowed since Dre's bow at the door. She thought of Thomas, of the 11 shillings in the tin box, of how easily a man like Dre might see to it that a bookkeeper's daughter found no honest work anywhere in the county ever again. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "if I am to finish what I've started, I will need considerably more than an hour. And I suspect Mr. Dre will not make the finishing easy." Julian looked at her for a long moment, really looked, the way he had not allowed himself to since she'd first appeared shivering in his doorway, and made the decision that would unravel everything Dre had spent 11 years building. "Then you had better stay the week, Miss Fenwick." She stayed, and the week became a fortnight. And in that time, Meg Fenwick learned Rothmere Hall the way she had once learned her father's mill accounts, by touching every corner of it until nothing remained hidden. She worked mostly at night, when the house had gone quiet and Dre's comings and goings could not interrupt her, tracing the false Michaelmas sums backward through years of ledgers until the pattern became a shape she could no longer mistake for coincidence. £40 here, 35 there. Always dressed up as tenant arrears. Always attributed to some farm or family, too poor or too frightened to dispute an estate manager's word. It was Thomas's letter, delivered by a carter 3 days into the second week, that nearly undid her resolve entirely. "The cough is worse, Meg. Mrs. Alders says it's gone to his chest proper now. The apothecary wants 2 shillings for the tonic, and I haven't got it, and neither has she." Meg read it twice in the cold corridor outside the kitchen, then folded it into her sleeve and returned to the ledgers, because there was nothing else to be done. No coin at Rothmere Hall was hers to send. Not yet. Not until the work was finished and paid. It was Julian who found her there past midnight, candle burned low, and it was the sight of her face, not tired, but frightened in a way he had not seen since her first morning at the hall, that made him ask what troubled her. She told him, briefly, without asking for pity, and he said nothing for a long moment, before quietly placing 3 shillings on the desk beside her ledger. "An advance," he said, "on wages not yet agreed to." She did not thank him, she simply nodded, because thanking him would have undone something in her chest she could not afford to lose just then, and went back to the columns of figures that had begun, at last, to speak. The break came 2 nights later. Buried in a drawer of correspondence Dre believed no one else had cause to open, Meg found a letter, not from a tenant, not about rents at all, but a private note between Dre and a solicitor in Harrogate, discussing the favourable terms of an upcoming marriage settlement, and a Miss Harriet Colston's very particular interest in seeing the Rothmere debts resolved swiftly and to mutual advantage. She read it 3 times before she understood what she was looking at. Lady Prudence's chosen heiress was not a stranger to Dre at all. Meg carried the letter to Julian's study with hands that would not quite stay steady, and when he read it, she watched the last of his composure crack. "He didn't merely steal from the estate," Julian said slowly, as though the words themselves were difficult to hold. "He's been steering me toward her for months. My mother believes it her own idea. He needed the debts to remain," Meg said. "A solvent duke has no need of an heiress's fortune, but a ruined one. Marries where his mother tells him to, and asks no questions about where the money came from." Julian set the letter down with the careful precision of a man forcing his hands to be steady. "Dre did not merely rob me, Miss Fenwick. He built the very trap he intends to marry me into." Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the old windows of Rothmere Hall, and somewhere below them, a door opened and closed in the dark. Dre had been listening. Neither of them could prove it. Not that night, not with the door already closed and the corridor empty by the time Julian threw it open, but Meg had heard the particular quiet that follows a person moving quickly and carefully away, and she said as much, and Julian did not argue. By morning, the household had changed shape without anyone announcing it. Mrs. Colby reported that Dre had ridden out before dawn, ostensibly to inspect the eastern boundary fences, though he'd taken his good coat and the leather satchel he kept his private papers in, not the sort of thing a man carried to look at fences. "He's gone to warn her," Meg said, "or to move whatever money remains before anyone thinks to ask where it's gone." "Or both," Julian said grimly. There was no time now for careful, quiet accounting. Rent collection day stood 4 days off, the one occasion each quarter when every tenant farmer on the estate gathered in the courtyard to pay what was owed and hear, in turn, what the estate owed them. Repairs promised, disputes settled, the small business of a working manor conducted in full view of everyone who depended on it. It was, Meg realized, the only place where a lie 11 years in the making could be undone in front of enough witnesses that it could never be quietly buried again. "If we wait for Dre to make his next move, he'll have time to cover this," Meg said. "But if we're ready for him on rent day, in front of every tenant whose arrears he's been inventing, he'll have no room to talk his way free of it." Julian finished the thought, something sharpening in his expression that Meg had not seen there before, not the weary resignation of a man drowning in debts he didn't understand, but the focus of a man who had finally found something worth fighting properly for. "My mother will be there as well. She ought to hear it from the Ledgers themselves, not from me." They worked through what remained of those 4 days as though the house itself were a ship being readied for storm. Meg cross-referenced every falsified entry against tenant testimony Mrs. Colby quietly gathered. Families who had paid rents Dre recorded as unpaid. Repairs billed to the estate that had never been made. Julian wrote to his solicitor in Leeds, not for advice this time, but for confirmation. Harriet Colston's fortune, it turned out, came almost entirely through a late uncle's investments. Investments managed, for the past 6 years, by one Cornelius Dre. "It isn't a marriage he's arranging," Julian said, reading the solicitor's reply aloud in a voice gone hollow with disbelief. "It's a merger. My debts, her fortune, his hand on both. And no one the wiser once the wedding lines are signed." Lady Prudence, when told, did not weep or rage as Julian had feared. She went very pale and very still and asked only one question. "How long has he been laughing at me, Julian?" 11 years, I should think," Meg said gently, "though I don't believe he ever laughed. Men like Dre don't require malice, only patience." On the eve of rent day, Meg sat alone in the study long after the candles in the rest of the house had gone dark. The true ledger, copied clean in her own steady hand, every falsified sum corrected beside its honest twin, open before her like a confession waiting to be read aloud. Tomorrow, Dre would stand before every tenant on the estate. Tomorrow, she would find out whether 11 shillings and a dead father's arithmetic were enough to bring down a man who had spent a decade learning exactly how not to be caught. The courtyard of Rothmere Hall had never held so many people at once, nor so much silence. Tenant farmers stood in loose clusters against the cold, breath fogging in the pale morning light, waiting for the business of rent day to begin as it always had. A table, a ledger, Mr. Dre's careful tally of what was owed and what had been paid. What they had not expected was to find the Duke himself standing behind that table, nor the young woman beside him with a second ledger under her arm, nor the particular stillness in Lady Prudence's face as she stood a few steps back, watching her son with an expression none of the tenants could quite read. Dre arrived last, as he always did, and something in his stride faltered when he saw the arrangement waiting for him. "Your Grace." His bow was slower this time. "I wasn't aware the rent day proceedings had changed." "They haven't," Julian said. "Only who conducts them." Meg stepped forward and opened the ledger. "Mr. Dre," she said, her voice carrying clean across the courtyard, "you recorded the Whitby Farms Michaelmas rent as unpaid 3 years running. I have here Mrs. Whitby's receipt, in your own hand, showing payment received in full each of those years." She turned a page. "You recorded repairs to the Aldous cottage roof. £42, billed to the estate, though Mr. Aldous will tell you, if asked, that his roof has leaked steadily since his father's time, and no repair was ever made." A murmur moved through the gathered tenants, recognition, then something harder. "That's a serious accusation from a woman with no standing to make it," Dre said, though his voice had lost its earlier ease. "She has my standing," Julian said, "because I have given it to her. Every figure she has named, I have verified myself against your own correspondence, including a letter to a solicitor in Harrogate, discussing the favourable terms of a marriage settlement between myself and Miss Harriet Colston, whose late uncle's fortune, I understand, you have personally managed for the past 6 years." The courtyard had gone entirely silent now. "You did not merely steal from this estate, Mr. Dre," Julian went on, and there was no anger in his voice, only a terrible, quiet certainty. "You manufactured its ruin, so that I would have no choice but to marry into money you already controlled. 11 years of tenant rents, diverted into the very debt you then offered to solve." Dre's composure did not break so much as simply drain away, like water through a cracked vessel. He looked once at the assembled tenants, men and women who had trusted him with their arrears, their disputes, their small yearly reckonings, and found no ally among any of them. "I built this estate's survival with my own hands," he said finally, low and bitter, "while you sat in London pretending your father's debts would settle themselves." "Perhaps," Julian said, "but you did not build it, Mr. Dre. You built a cage and called it survival." He nodded once to the 2 constables Mrs. Colby had quietly sent for that morning, waiting at the courtyard gate. It was Meg, not Julian, who spoke the last words Dre heard before he was led away, not in triumph, but simply because they were true. "Numbers don't lie for very long, Mr. Dre. I did warn you." The courtyard did not erupt into celebration. Yorkshire tenants were not given to such displays. But something eased in the gathered crowd that had not been there in years, a loosening, like a held breath finally released. Lady Prudence crossed to Meg before the crowd had fully dispersed. "I owe you an apology, Miss Fenwick. I mistook competence for impertinence. It seems I was very wrong." "You were only afraid, my lady," Meg said, "as we all were." Julian found her later in the study, the true ledger closed at last on the desk between them. "I offered you a position, once, rather badly," he said. "You offered me a wife, Your Grace. I believe I applied for something else entirely. Then let me try again." He held out his hand, not for a ledger this time. "Rothmere needs a bookkeeper it can trust. And I find I need rather more than that." 3 weeks later, Thomas coughed less, ate more, and complained loudly about his sister's insistence he finish his medicine. A small, ordinary miracle, bought with honest wages and 11 shillings, that for the first time in years no longer had to be the last of anything.